And I frown upon these methods. But let me tell you how they started and who started them. Bombs in cafes are such menacing, horrific methods of murder. They first appeared on our land in 1937 by Zionist groups in Palestine on March 17 in Jaffa, if you want to be detailed. What about bombs on buses? Well, those two were first pioneered by Zionists in 1937, between August and September of that year. What about bombs in marketplace? They were first used by Zionists on July 6, 1938 in Haifa. And they were also used in Jaffa. Read about that by a Zionist historian, Walter Laqueur, in his book History of Zionism. What about bombings of hotel? Of course, you heard about that because they did that against the white man, the British. First used by Zionists on July 6, 1938 in Haifa. The first King David Hotel was July 22nd, 1946 in Jerusalem. Bombing of foreign embassies, first used by Zionists October 1st, 1946 in Rome against the British. Mining of ambulances, they did that a lot. First used by Zionists on October 31st, 1946 in Petah Tikva. Letter bombs, they continued to use letter bombs into the 1980s. One of the greatest Palestinian historians, Anis Saigh, his name is not known by you, but his name is very well known to me. And he founded a Palestine Research Center. Never held a gun in his life. Never used violence. Never knew what violence is firsthand, except when it hit him. Because he founded an effective research center in Lebanon, he received a letter bomb, and he is almost completely blind, and his fingers are gone. I know because I shook his hand. If you've seen the movie Munich, there is one reference in a bad movie otherwise to the Palestinian writer who was killed in Rome, and he's never committed any crime, never used violence because the Israelis decided to do so. So these are examples. Now, when we speak about apartheid in Israel, I want to say a few points. I believe the description is quite apt because Israel has continued to use a system of separation and to allocate services and punishment on the basis of membership to one group or the other. From its very inception, Zionism was based on violence and racism. Maxim Rodinson, when he spoke about the history of Zionism, he said, let's face it, Zionism was born in the 19th century Europe, which is a racist colonial times. But in the case of Israel, there is double racism. There is the Zionism, there is racism of Zionists against the Palestinians, which you are familiar with. But you have to remember also, Israel is a racist state against Jews who happen to come from Asian and African countries. There is the racism of the European Jews against the non-European Jews. You have to read the book by Tom Segev, an Israeli historian, his book 1949. When Yemeni Jews, some of the most ancient Jews of the region, came to Israel, they were treated like they had some incurable diseases. They were put in tents, treated like leopards. And to this very day, in the United States Zionist media, they celebrated when the Bush administration of the 1980s arranged for a secret transfer of Ethiopian Jews into Israel, the famous falashas. You have to read what's happening to the falashas in Israel today. They are being subjected to racism in schools and at every level of their lives. They are being called the N-word, the equivalent of that in Hebrew, in schools where they go to. So you have to remember the double racism of Israel. From the very origin, Israel was based on racism and the necessity of using violence against the Palestinians. It's not like they did not know the Palestinians were on the land. They knew, but they said, we can conquer them by force. It's like there was a slogan by one Zionist, Israel Zangwill, which is called, a land without a people for a people without a land. And And this was very confusing for people who knew the region. I mean, there is a people over the land. These are the Palestinians. But no, I mean, the Zionists were consistent. They meant what they said. When they said land without a people, they meant land without a people like us. I mean, they meant they do not amount to peoplehood. I mean, people in Britain in 1969 were appalled because the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, was interviewed by a British reporter. And unlike the American press, they do interrogate Israeli leaders for the crimes against the Palestinians. So the reporter asked Golda Meir of the time, how do you justify what you've done to the Palestinians? And she said, who the Palestinians? There's no such thing as the Palestinians. This is an actual quotation. I mean, that's what it meant. I mean, yes, they do exist physically and they do procreate. And she wrote in her memoirs that the procreation of Palestinians is something that keeps her late up at night. I mean, that's how blatantly racist they are in what they write in Hebrew. Of course, to the Americans, they claim it's a liberal project over there. So they knew what they were talking about. And the founder of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl, was asked at one point. I mean, he knew there are Palestinians, and he mentioned that in his book in 1902, Alt Neuland. But before that, he was asked, how are you going to be able to establish a state where there is already people there? And he quoted to them the French proverb, qui veut la fin veut les moyens. I mean, they meant to use violent means to conquer the Palestinian people. They knew what they were talking about. And I have to say, some early Zionists knew that what's happening is quite appalling. I mean, there is one guy, Ahad Ha'am, who is a well-known writer who modernized the writing of modern Hebrew. And Ahad Ha'am wrote a famous essay at the turn of the century in which he described the violence which is being subjected against the Palestinians by the Zionist immigrant. Ben Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, who was the most influential leader of Zionism in the 20th century, was quite blatant about in his racism against the Palestinians. He said, they remind me of children. When he first came and landed in Israel, and his first encounter, according to the biography of Ben Gurion by Shabtai Teves, I mean, he said they are like children. And he treated them like children. I mean, they were beaten publicly, as Ahad Ha'am described in the essay I was talking about. And they practiced economic apartheid from very early on, 1930s. I mean, they resorted to Hebrew labor, meaning, I mean, this is why there was the famous 1936 rebellion by Palestinians, which lasted for 3 years. It had many causes. One of the causes is that Palestinians were being driven from the land, and then the Palestinians going to the city, they could not find job because the Zionist enterprises adhered to what was referred to as Hebrew labor, meaning these enterprises will not hire Palestinians. I mean, this is like when it was in America, a system of separation of water fountain and others. That's exactly what happened. Now, it comes back to 1948 and the founding. And you have to remember that the racist element within Zionism has never been absent. The question is whether it was blatant or it's not blatant. I mean, now when we read Zionist history, we know in their deliberation and in their private letters and discussions, they were very blatant. I mean, David Ben Gurion wrote to his son about how we were going to expel the Arabs. I mean, these things were, it's not that they were spontaneous in the heat of the battles as we were led to believe later on in their propaganda. They knew what they were doing. And the racist element, look at the element in Zionism which is called the revisionist Zionism. So in Israel, roughly, there are two major camps that are switching political government in Israel. The Labour Party and the Likud and the Kadima. The Likud and the Kadima are the descendants of the revisionist Zionists. The Prime Minister of Israel today is Likud, meaning revisionist Zionist. Labour are descendant of the Ben Gurion and the mainstream Zionists. Let me tell you who the revisionist Zionists are. The forefathers of the Prime Minister of Israel today, Benjamin Netanyahu. Vladimir Jabotinsky defined nation. He said it's not by history or culture or so on. He said it's defined by its racial recipe. That is revisionist Zionism which rules Israel today. They knew what they were talking about, and he was unabashedly impressed and influenced by the fascist nationalist movements of Europe of the time. Israel was founded by conquest. We do not have to debate how Israel was founded now. We don't have to argue